Wow, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2023, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Google and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, Barrier Break and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, and if you have any questions for the presenter, please post them there using the ID24 hashtag. Alternatively, you can put your questions directly into the YouTube chat for this session. And at the end of the talk, we'll collate everything for a short Q&A. A reminder on that topic that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. So don't go misbehaving. Now, I am thrilled and honored to be joined once again by my co-host, Gareth Ford-Williams. Gareth, over to you.
Hi. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm very, actually quite relieved in a way, actually, to introduce this next talk, because it was the one topic I've been asked to research next week, and it's going to save me an enormous amount of time. So next we have Sam Prue. And Samuel is going to talk about conversational interfaces in a talk entitled Designing for the Next Interface Paradigm Shift. So over to you, Samuel.
All right. Thanks so much for the great introduction. Really glad to be here. Hopefully this talk will be helpful and useful to you in your research. I wrote the talk description, and then I wrote about 4 different talk outlines, because this is such a broad field, and there are so many considerations and so many ways to approach the topic. But I finally settled on one that I think is great and that I think we'll all get something from. Before we begin, first of all, a little bit about me. I'm Sam Prue. I am the accessibility evangelist at Fable, which means that I get to do a lot of talking about accessibility, about not only sort of how to do it, but why to do it, and some of the higher level stuff like that. I am a middle-aged white man with brown hair and a thick beard, and I'm sitting here coming to you live from my home office here in Ottawa, Canada. We've had a couple of great talks representing Canada here at ID24. I'm also completely blind and a full-time screen reader user. And one of the moderators over at the R Blind official blindness subreddit. When I'm not talking about kind of accessibility and doing the thing that we're all incredibly passionate about, playing a lot of online games, so was super interested in that previous talk that Hector gave just before this one. Great talk to have to follow up. Or reading science fiction and fantasy ebooks, and dreaming about those talking computers like they had on Star Trek, where you could just have a conversation with them and they would immediately do exactly what you wanted them to do. The company I work for is Fable. I'll talk about them for just a second. First of all, because I think understanding the company that I work for is really important when we're talking about the way that I think about and look at accessibility. Because at Fable, we're all about connecting people with disabilities to large organizations, whether that is for ongoing research and testing, or whether it's in the training offering that we provide. And that is going to become increasingly important as we talk about conversational interfaces. And I think some of those reasons for why that's important are going to become clear as I continue to give this talk. If these services are something that you're interested in, something that you feel like your organization could use, absolutely check us out. We're over at makeitfable.com, and you can find us at makeitfable on Twitter or LinkedIn, which is also linked in the show notes on the Inclusive Design 24 website. That said, enough about me and where I work. Let's start and dive into the actual meat of the talk today. First of all, what is a conversational interface? What do we mean by that? I want to take just a minute to define what I mean by conversational interface, because I think some of the giant movers in the space have caused us perhaps to think that whenever someone says conversational interfaces, they mean AI. They mean Google Bard, or they mean ChatGPT, or they mean kind of one of those AI-based text generative interfaces. And yes, those are conversational interfaces, and they generally do present themselves in that kind of conversational interface manner. But I want us to take a step back for a minute, because conversational interfaces are more than just that. And I hope some of you didn't sort of get your hopes up too high, because this is not necessarily or even primarily an AI talk. This is an interface talk, and we're going to be talking about the considerations that come when you change your interface model. So when I am thinking about a conversational interface, I'm thinking of something that offers open, apparently unrestricted input. I want to differentiate that from something like the Linux command line that we may all be familiar with. It provides a command line where you can type, but it makes absolutely no bones about the fact that the input is restricted and you need to read the manual and learn a bunch of switches and a bunch of triggers and kind of, a scripting language like Bash or SH. And it also offers flexible, apparently unrestricted output. Again, differentiating it from something like a command line or some sort of scripting system where you always get the same output, and the output is so predictable that it is often piped or fed into other scripts. And it can input or output in multiple modalities. Most conversational interfaces can input via text, or via voice, or via image, and they can output via text, voice, image, graph, data, some of them now even with animation and video. And so when I'm talking about a conversational interface, this is what I mean. Unrestricted multimodal input and unrestricted multimodal output. And as I said, not all conversational interfaces require or even depend on large language models. For those of you who perhaps don't know, a large language model is what is behind things like GPT-3, GPT-4, Bard, and all of the other kind of AI-based conversational interfaces that have come on gangbusters over the past couple of years. But, Siri and Google Assistant were around long before large language models were a thing. We're going to talk a little bit later about interactive fiction, or it may be more commonly known to you as the text adventure or the text computer game. It's also pattern matching chatbots, like the work of Dr. Wallace and the Alice chatbot using AIML, the standard proposed artificial intelligence markup language that some of you may have been familiar with. It was pattern matching, case-based reasoning, regular expression matching, and a bunch of JavaScript tricks in order to sort of do that same thing, to create a chatbot that input and output in a conversational way. And then there are, of course, case-based reasoning knowledge bases where you can input kind of text and they will perform logical transforms based on context and context-free grammars, and output similarly. And lastly, what you may not think about is smart search. Today, when you do a smart search, we've moved away from the so-called conversational interface, and you'll generally have what is almost a query builder. So it will say, include this, have one text box, not include that, have one text box, have a bunch of checkboxes to help you control whether words are and or ored, because we've discovered that sort of having people put in the Boolean, operators in a natural language conversational way doesn't always work and isn't always the greatest way of doing things. I remember in some of those old, more Boolean-based search engines, back in the day, InfoSeek, Dogpile, AltaVista, I remember doing a search query on AltaVista, and I wanted to find information about the band The Who. And so I put in The Who into the text box, and it told me "the" is a very common word and hasn't been included in your search. "Who" is a very common word and hasn't been included in your search. 0 results. So that's, those early search engines were one of the earliest kind of signs that we saw that manipulating user input in order to do sensible things with it has a lot of edge cases and can be a little bit harder than we at first think it is. And so let's dive right in and talk about some of those early conversational interfaces. And the first conversational interface we're going to talk about goes way back, way before even AltaVista. The first conversational interface that I am aware of is the ELIZA chatbot. And it was developed by Dr. Joseph Weizenbaum in 1976. Weizenbaum was a psychologist and computer researcher, and he developed a chatbot that was intended to mimic a therapist. And when he did this, I think he was mainly thinking of it as kind of a proof of concept. And the way that it worked is it would take the user input and it would look to find keywords. So when you included words like "I" or "me," it would respond with something like, "Why do you think this is about you?" When you included words like "father" or "mother," it would respond, "Do you think this has something to do with your parents?" And it was all really just a keyword-based trick in order to take the user's input and provide them with a response that they thought would be meaningful. Now, to his surprise, when he did that, he found that people immediately got very invested in the chatbot that he had created. And his secretary at the time actually told him that he needed to leave the room because she wanted to be alone and have some privacy with what she considered this digital therapist, even though it was really just a set of tricks that could easily be replicated in BASIC on the early 8K of memory home computers at the time. And I have a quote up here which says, "This joining of an illicit metaphor to an ill-thought-out idea then breeds and is perceived to legitimate such perverse propositions as that, for example, a computer can be programmed to become an effective psychotherapist." This was something that was frightening him way back in 1976. And I think that quote is oddly poignant as we start to think about some of the ways in which we are using conversational interfaces hooked up to large language models today. I'm reminded of a news story in which a nonprofit, well-intentioned in the UK, needed to take down its chatbot that was offering advice to those coping with eating disorders because the advice that it was giving was not as good as they intended. And there are dangers here because humans are what I like to call meaning finders. If you give somebody a conversational sort of opening, whether it's in text or whether it's in audio, you are going to take that person's response and you are going to find patterns and you are going to find meaning. And if you don't have a really strong model in your mind of how that system is working and exactly how it is processing your input in order to derive its output, you are going to assign meaning to that. You are going to assume that it has understood you. And when it says something that isn't quite right, maybe it's not quite grammatical, maybe it feels like a change in topic, you are going to assume good faith and understanding and discount those mistakes and failures. And that will cause you to perhaps trust the system far, far more than you should. And depending on how the system is being used, our assumption of good faith and our willingness to anthropomorphize things may not serve us well as we move forward into this new interface paradigm where our interlocutor is certainly not a human and its understanding and world model may not be knowable. The next conversational interface I'd like to talk about is SHRDLU. It was named from the popular typographical phrase that you would sometimes see when typesetters were testing out their printing presses on paper. And SHRDLU was an AI system that was developed in Lisp back in the 1970s and 80s. And its purpose was in order to demonstrate human-level language understanding in order to follow conversational commands and describe the state of the world model. And I have a quote up here of somebody interacting with the SHRDLU system. The person says, "What does the box contain?" The computer responds, "The blue pyramid and the blue block." The person says, "What is the pyramid supported by?" The computer says, "The box." The person says, "How many blocks are not in the box?" The computer says, 4 of them. The person says, "Is at least one of them narrower than the one which I told you to pick up?" And the computer says, "Yes, the red cube." This is a quote taken from a popular transcript of a researcher interacting with the SHRDLU system. However, this quote worked far better than the SHRDLU system did in real life. You might be marveling at this and saying, wow, if this was possible back in the 70s and 80s, how come we don't have the science fiction conversational computer today? Well, there are a few reasons for that. First of all, the designers of the system already know the available functionality. In a system that says you can type whatever you want, designers and developers and programmers tend to type in only the things that they know that it can do or that it might have a reasonable chance of handling. Not necessarily because they want to provide impressive tech demos, but because if they could think of typing that in or asking that question, they would program it to be able to answer that question. And it's the things that they haven't thought of that the system may not be able to handle because it won't be tested for. And designers have designed functionality that seems discoverable to them, and they have failed to take into account other types of queries. And so if you think about a world with some shapes and some cubes and some boxes, you could ask the system to do many, many things with those cubes and boxes. You could say, change the red cube so it's blue. Well, the system couldn't do that. But because what has been created is a conversational system that seems to allow unrestricted output and unrestricted input, that is not necessarily obvious to the user. Think of our smart home assistants today, our Google Homes and our Siris. Those of us who have been using them for quite some time probably have a pretty good idea of the kinds of things that they can do for us and the kind of questions that they can handle. But if you put those in the hands of somebody who is perhaps older, who is less tech literate, who to them these devices just seem like magic, they don't understand how they work, I bet you that 3 out of the first 4 requests that they make are going to be requests that the device can't handle. And this can have real consequences. Because when these systems developed in the kind of 70s and 80s and the first AI boom were developed, they believed that symbolic logic was the key to artificial intelligence. Because they were working in this bubble of tech people, AI people, all reading each other's papers and testing each other's systems, they got into this bubble and were making predictions like, we would have AI solved in the next 10 years. And they believed that they really had created these great things. And because they weren't being tested, they were restricted to the research kind of lab, and they were on the mainframe, they weren't being putting out in front of people. And so they were way, way overhyped, and the expectations became terribly misaligned with their capabilities. I mean, if you want to think about the ways in which we thought about computers in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and the ways that we thought symbolic logic and some of these kind of, AI and thought-based things were going to change the world, there is a language that you can look up called Lojban, which was a language that was created that they thought all humans would just learn and be taught, and it was a language that made logical precepts easier to express and reason about. But they weren't thinking of like a programming language. It was just, that's the language that you use to talk to computers. If you think back to Star Wars and think about some of the ways in which they talk about computer languages, they don't call them programming languages, right? They're just thinking of a language that all computers will speak and all humans will speak, and that's how we'll have conversations. That is obviously today a little bit silly. But conversational interfaces would be rolled out. They would be rolled out in something that today is commonly called interactive fiction. Though if you were around at the time, or if you are familiar with your gaming history, you might be familiar with it as text adventures. You may be familiar with games like Adventure, or Dungeon, or Zork, developed by the company Infocom. And these games were marketed as interactive stories, where you were given a description of what was happening, and you could type anything that you wanted, and you could be part of the story. But that fell down pretty quickly. I've got a quote on the slide here. It's a quote from a game that I remember playing back in the day. It was actually a text adventure game called Terrible Lizards, and it was a game about dinosaurs, and there was a scavenger hunt, and there were some robots and things like this. And the quote is a player typing, "Examine bot." And the game responds, "Which bot do you mean? Your bot or the black bot?" A reasonable response for clarification, and the player types, "Examine my bot." And the computer says, "I don't know the word my." And the player says, "Examine your bot." And it says, "I don't know the word your." The player tries, "Examine white bot." And the computer says, "You don't see any white bot here." This highlights a few different problems that we very quickly run into when we think about the conversational interface. These were marketed as interactive stories and were the first wide-scale rollout of conversational systems. But there's a reason that we don't have much interactive fiction or parser-based text adventures going on anymore. Because most of the people who bought them found them utterly impenetrable and impossible to finish. They were purchased because they were a dream, the ability to type to the computer and have it respond sensibly back to you. But the first problem we saw there was guess the verb. Commands and nouns that the game knew and how those commands and nouns interact were not easy or discoverable. We told users that they could type whatever they wanted, but if they typed "look at" the bot, it wouldn't work. You noticed in that quote, it was saying "examine," because that's how you would, look closer at an object. "Look at" wouldn't work. "Investigate" certainly was right out. There's a common story that Graham Nelson, one of the premier designers and most kind of well-known famous designers of these text adventures, talks about in a game that he was writing. The player was wearing a coat and wanted to take it off. and he had encoded take off coat and remove coat. And the first time he gave his brand new game to a player to test it, what did they do? They typed doff coat. And so, there's such a wide range of the ways that things can be expressed. And then there is the combinatorial explosion of verbs and objects. In many of these text adventures, they wanted to provide an enormously complex world model and give the users as many commands and as much agency as they possibly could. And so that meant that search the table, examine the table, and look under the table were 3 different commands that would give you 3 different results. And so it made puzzle solving almost impossible. And the openness would create all kinds of what we call red herrings. A red herring being something that is possible to do, but does not move the user any closer to their goal. It was just created as a fun sort of, response. Things like pray or jump or sleep even were, given responses because they were things that the user could type, and the game didn't want to respond with, I don't know that word, but they did not move the user any closer to their goal. However, because the user is interacting with a conversational-based interface, they don't know that. Think about a calendar, whether it's your Outlook calendar or your Google calendar. When that calendar comes up on screen, you have a pretty good idea of how the designers and the programmers have modeled dates, right? There's months and years and weeks, and you can create events, and you can create the event at a particular time, and the interface has maybe a little plus, so you can set your event to be recurring, and you can invite other people. If you give somebody a conversational calendar interface, maybe it's just a text box. Can they type schedule an appointment next Tuesday? Can they type schedule an appointment that will happen on the first Wednesday of every month? Can they type schedule an appointment with my dentist? Because text adventures or conversational interfaces do not do a good job of revealing the models behind them. And by that, I don't necessarily mean the AI model. I just mean the interaction model behind them. They can very quickly become very confusing to users. And that's why interactive fiction today has transferred away from conversational interfaces. When you pick up an adventure game today, you're probably picking up something that is point and click, or something that is choice-based. Because we very quickly realized the advantages of not letting the user type absolutely anything they want, but of giving the user some guidance. These are the hotspots that you can click on. These are some of the tools at the bottom that you can, click to interact with them. In a choice-based game, right, you give the user the text and you say, these are the 5 or 6 or 7 things that you could do, because conversational interfaces, we discovered, might not always be the most fun for the user when they're just trying to play a game and experience the game and have some fun. And yet, skills on Google Home and Alexa and all of the other smart assistants, people are suddenly saying, hey, why don't we create games on these? And it seems like we might be repeating that cycle just a little bit. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from game design in the 80s and 90s. That said, let's talk about some modern conversational interfaces. Where can you find them today? Conversational interfaces are in a lot more than just ChatGPT and Google Bard and kind of these AI chat boxes. And they are not anymore in our adventure games. We've taken those out, it feels like. Today, they're found in Home Assistant apps, web browsers, support chatbots, operating systems, and search engines. And they are used for all kinds of things. Everything from education and training to accessibility with things like Be My Eyes and Be My AI, to tech support. How many websites do you go to now have a tech support or a marketing little chat thing, to data analysis, to hardware control, to climate controls, to even medical queries. The problem is that their use is not always disclosed. Because the interesting thing about a conversational interface, especially when it is accepting text input and giving text output, is that you don't necessarily need to disclose. Is there a human behind this? Is there a large language model behind this? Is this a case-based reasoning system? Are we just doing pattern matching? What is happening here? Are we perhaps even just ignoring your response and responding with whatever we want to say? It's not always possible for the user to tell. And that can cause a lot of problems. But there are a lot of perceived advantages, and there is a reason why, after experimenting with these interfaces throughout the 80s and 90s, we find ourselves with big data and AI being drawn back into them again. First of all, they feel a lot less complex for the user. Users just speak or type. They don't have to learn complex interfaces or control elements, and the design can be very minimal. And so all of the complexity of, the Outlook calendar, the Google Calendar, we think, we can just take that away from the user, and we just give the user a text box or a microphone, and they can now interact with our system without having to learn anything. It also feels easier to extend, because it feels like interface changes might not be required in order to introduce new functions. If all your interface is a text box or a microphone, if you want to add the ability to schedule recurring events, all you need to do is add the ability to schedule something every month or every week. Whereas if you wanted to do that to a graphical calendar interface, now you have to get a designer and you have to think about, okay, where do we put the recurring dropdown, and how do we represent this to the user, and how do we make it so they can do things not just weekly, but bi-weekly and every quarter and every third Wednesday of months that start with M. And you have to think about all those things. It feels like in a conversational interface, it might be easier to do that. And of course, all of that complexity is hidden from the user, making it look minimal and neat to them. But of course, that comes with a lot of disadvantages. There is no discoverability in a conversational interface. The available functions are completely unknown, and the user doesn't always know how to find them. Now, some conversational interfaces and home assistants have started trying to overcome that problem by, for example, when I ask to turn on my light, saying, "Hey, by the way, did you also know that you could ask me to call Jeff?" And that might have had no relation to the thing that I'm trying to do. If you look through some of the Reddit and forum and Google and support threads for these conversational interfaces, one of the most common queries that you find people asking is, how do I turn these tips off? Because they're not presented to us when we want them. There's also the strong potential to mislead users, whether it is a hallucination caused by a large language model or just the pattern matching falsely understanding the user and giving them wrong or incorrect info. The user has no idea what is going on inside your system. And so they have no idea how much trust they should give to the information they're getting. Think about when you Google for a website or for some information. You're given a list of websites. One of them might be Wikipedia. One of them might be the National Health Service of the UK, and one of them might be a blog by some guy named Joe who you've never heard of. But the interface affordances of the web address and the side menus and all of these different things provide you with a lot of information that you can use to decide, am I going to trust this information? Whereas when you type a thing in a text box and you get a response, you don't have all of that context. Also, most modern conversational interfaces are not reproducible. What I mean by that is, they do not necessarily respond to identical inputs with identical outputs. Large language models, of course, do not do that. But even most of our home assistants today don't do that. If you tell them to do something, they might respond, sure, or okay, or great. If they have an error, they might have 5 or 6 different error messages that all mean the same thing, but they sound more conversational. I don't know if you've ever taught somebody who is less computer literate how to use a computer. But one of the techniques they frequently use is they'll get out a pen of paper and they'll write, okay, click the button, then go to the right 3 times, and then right-click, and then type this piece of text, and then press the Enter key. And they'll make a whole step-by-step system for themselves. You know, that may not be the greatest way to use a computer or a phone, but it is a way, and it is a method and a tactic that people use. But when our systems are not reproducible, that becomes almost impossible, because it completely breaks down their ability to say, okay, when I say this, it's going to say this other thing, and then I say this. Well, it might not. It might say something else that means the same thing, but it breaks down that ability for certain users to learn. And of course, they're difficult to troubleshoot. What do users try when the answer is unhelpful? Maybe you've called in to one of those tech support lines on the phone, and it is very proud of itself, and it says, "Hi, I can provide you with support. Just say what you want." And of course, the problem you're having is some problem that the creators of the phone-based AI support system have never thought of. But it doesn't tell you if you need to speak to a human, say operator, or whatever you might need. And it really highlights not only the discoverability problem. You have no idea what you can ask, but when you ask something and the answer it gives is totally useless, what do you do from there? And so this leads us into a number of accessibility concerns when it comes to creating conversational interfaces. First of all, considerations for multilingual users. When you give someone a text box, how do they necessarily know what languages the system will understand? When you're on a website, it's real easy, right? Maybe there are those flags or those words in different languages. Okay, I'm going to click on the little thing and it'll switch into my language, and that's easy, and I've got it. With a conversational interface, it might speak your language. It might not speak your language. It might pretend to speak your language. It might speak your language, but not as well as it speaks English. And secondly, how does it respond to unusual phrases from non-native speakers? We had an example that I gave a while ago of that person saying doff coat. That's, not even a non-native English speaker. That's just, a more advanced or perhaps a reasonable word for removing clothing. But how do you respond when the user might have made a mistake in grammar, a mistake in spelling, a mistake in syntax? Too often, the response that you give is inadequate, unhelpful, or entirely useless. And of course, we had a great talk last night about inclusive design, including Indigenous folks. And we had another great talk this afternoon around internationalization and kind of that world of accessibility. All of these things are exacerbated when we start to think about the conversational interface. And of course, there are concerns for users with sensory challenges. What format is the system going to respond in? When conversational interfaces came back with a vengeance with the Smart Home Assistant, you could only interact by voice. Later on, they created the ability to type into the assistant, to the conversational interface, although some systems still require you to use voice and don't allow you to type. But interestingly, some systems, when you type in text, will actually respond with voice. A little bit surprising. Also, some systems, when you type in a query with voice, will actually respond in text. It happens to me all the time. I ask my digital assistant a question, and she says, "Hey, I've sent a web page with more details about that to your phone," which is great for me because I happen to have access to a screen reader and be literate in the language with which I am interacting with this system. But that is certainly not the case for all users at all times. And of course, it's becoming more of a problem for me as conversational interfaces begin to advance. Sometimes I am using them as an accessibility feature, and I want to get a summary of some data. And so I'm asking something about, how did the population of my city change from 2010 to now? Some conversational interfaces will give me a summary of how that population changed. Some, of course, will make something up because they don't actually know, and I didn't realize that. But more and more frequently, some will respond with a graph. And as someone who is completely blind, that graph is useless to me. And so how do I tell the conversational interface what formats it can respond in, what formats it can't respond in, and what format I would like to give my input in? Because all of those things don't necessarily match. And of course, there are considerations for users with cognitive challenges. How can the user actually know if the system didn't understand them? Most systems won't give a clear error message. They'll try their best to answer and get it wrong. They'll make something up. They'll say something friendly like, "Hey, I'm afraid I can't do that right now," which of course comes with the implication that, well, they might be able to do it later. When is later? You, the developer or designer, might mean I can't do that now, as in this has been logged and I might think about implementing this as a feature in 10 days. But the user might think, oh, well, something's down. I'll try again in half an hour. How do users with difficulty speaking or writing interact? For those who are new to a language, it can be a lot easier to have a point-and-click interface rather than to be expected to speak or type something in and get a response. And of course, what if the system uses or expects overly complex language? We know to keep our user interfaces to sort of a grade 6 to 8 reading level. But what about our conversational interfaces? When the user uses complex language, does it mean that we can respond with complex language? If the user doesn't, does it mean that the system can't? We don't have good ways of modeling or indicating or thinking about this yet. And of course, how long are the system's responses, and do they include unrelated information? For those with cognitive challenges or with difficulty reading, writing, or listening, it can be quite challenging when you ask the system, "Hey, when is the opening hours to the grocery store?" And it responds, "Oh, I see you want to know the opening hours to the grocery store. Sure, I'd be delighted to help you with that. Let me look it up." And then it finally responds with the information. These are being done in order to help us humanize and anthropomorphize the system, although whether or not that's a good idea is up for debate. If you want a really interesting video on some of the challenges that can come when we start anthropomorphizing AI-based companions and AI-based conversational systems, Sarah Zed, the Canadian YouTuber, did a great YouTube video on the AI companion Replika and her experiences with that, and some of her thoughts and feelings on how it felt to be intentionally encouraged to anthropomorphize a system that wasn't actually real. And of course, there are problems verifying bias and accuracy. Those are problems for everyone, but they are even more exacerbated for those of us who are people with disabilities. Because users with disabilities may simply not be able to verify the accuracy. Sure, if I ask the opening hours for my favorite pizza place, if it gives me an answer, I can say, I really don't think that's open at 2 a.m. Let me Google that and double check. But if I ask for a description of a photo that I just took, I can't really Google to verify the answer. I might have to call on a sighted volunteer. But how do I know when I need to call on a sighted volunteer? Because of the conversational interface, I don't necessarily have a model of how confident the system is, or how sure it is, or any real way to tell whether it understood both the contents of the picture or what I was asking. And so I might decide, oh, it read that perfectly. I don't need to ask a human at all. And it's completely wrong. And of course, are users with disabilities being treated differently by the system? How can they tell? In the kind of early web days, there used to be the kind of accessibility bugaboo of the text-only interface, right? Everyone thought, well, we're going to have a little link that says text-only version, and it's going to be a completely different, separate but equal interface. With conversational interfaces, how can I tell if I'm being treated differently by the system because it has detected my screen reader? It might be a lot less obvious than I click the link text-only interface. And of course, there's bias and accuracy when it comes to training. Can the system answer accessibility-related questions? If not, how do I know where to ask? How accurate and complete are those accessibility-related answers? When you're dealing with a website or an app, well, either accessibility information is present or it isn't. It's less cut and dried when you're talking about conversational interfaces. And then, of course, there is censorship. When it comes to interfaces, apps, and programs, the only things that are there are the things that we put there, and often the only interface inputs that the user can provide are the inputs that we have programmed in. You can't click on anything that is not clickable. But when it comes to a conversational interface, well, what happens when the user asks your search engine a question about sex, a question about gender transition, a question about orientation, about racism, about culture? And of course, is the system honest and transparent about censorship? Is it saying, I can't do this because it's not allowed, or because my developers are not comfortable with this? Or is it just saying, oops, I think I didn't understand you, let's talk about something else? So, in conclusion, conversational interfaces require more testing than any other type of interface. And they require testing not by the QA analysts who are the experts at your organization, not by the developers, by the designers, or by the researchers, but they require testing by the users, because that's the only way you're going to figure out if they work. We have to go beyond just making sure the input and output interface is accessible. We've got to take into account the needs of people with disabilities, the purpose that people with disabilities are using the system for, which, by the way, may not be identical to the purpose that users without disabilities are using the system for, and the discovery and transparency for all users. The only way that we can do this and that we can make sure that our systems are accessible is by involving people with disabilities in every aspect of the system. Because if these things don't happen, people with disabilities are going to be excluded in newer, more frightening, and more systemic ways than ever before.
Excellent, Samuel. That was a really interesting, exciting talk. For my sins, I did back in my day look at things like ELIZA and similar tools myself, and I did play the various very frustrating text parser adventure games. So particularly that part of your talk resonated very strongly with me. I think we're a little bit short on time. I think Gareth told me off stage that he had hundreds of questions, but maybe we can have one or two.
I think it's more like I need to go and have a lie down after this one and have a really good think, because there was some really deeply, even if we were on the edge, some very philosophical points being made. I think there was also a really interesting little comment that popped up that someone said, yeah, it was an interesting point that systems give answers to questions whether they understand them or not. And this is probably where the danger lies more than anything else. But there was Oh gosh, yes, you've kind of set my ADHD brain off on so many rabbit holes of that. It's quite extraordinary. I now have to go and look up Animaniacs and Who's the Band on Stage skit that was done, because as soon as you mentioned Who, there's a wonderful bit of and I think this is almost a wonderful metaphor for conversational interfaces, where someone wants to know the name of the band on stage, and the name of the band on the stage is Who.
Still Abbott and Costello, who's on first base thing.
Exactly. It's they went and did it about the band, The Who, and as soon as you mentioned The Who, I was like, right, I'm going to have to look that one up. But it's a fascinating thing, because all of the things that you were bringing up are really old problems. We're just discovering almost like the edges of the problems rather than the answers to those problems at the moment. And going
and
from
the old quote, people who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. I think that we are not connecting all of these things.
Absolutely. I completed Colossal Adventure, and as soon as they became conversational interfaces, I stopped playing text adventures, because the whole point was trying to work out what the questions you could ask were, and that wasn't fun.
Yeah.
And they stripped the fun out of gaming. But I think there was that whole point. I would love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts around this, around the fact that people who were testing it were the designers, and the designers knew the phraseology that it had been designed to understand. They knew the limits of the system, which makes them the worst people to test it.
Yep.
And English is such a non-standard thing. Even if we just deal with one language, and you've got colloquialism. We talked offline right at the beginning about accents, and you've got to deal with that slang. You've got generational language. You've got non-English words that become parcel of it through product, brands, names, places. And so before you're even getting into complex topics like gender and gender identity, it's even understanding the basis of language. And I was starting to think what you thought about, the whole Steve Krug, don't make me think. Is our desire to make an interface simpler, creating more sort of learnability problems and weight for the user? It's actually by creating simplicity, we're actually creating complexity.
Absolutely. And part of the reason for that is because we are not actually creating simplicity. What we're saying is, ooh, don't worry your pretty little head about that. Let me hide all of the details of how the system actually works away from you. You can just type and say whatever you want and it'll work. What we're effectively doing is lying to the users.
Yes.
Right? Now they have to think, because we're actively lying to them in this effort to make things simpler. There's a quote, I wish I knew who said it, but someone said the tautology that complicated systems are complicated. And there's what that means is there's only so much complexity that you can hide. If you have a complicated system used to perform complicated functions, maybe you need to expose those things to the user so that they'll know if they can schedule a recurring event on the first full moon of every year that ends in 2.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. I have to say that's usually the feeling I get whenever I have to use a Mac. It's all iOS. It's all very sleek until you want to do something, and it's like, yeah, it's this hidden function. Anyway, I'm really sorry. We'll have to cut it short here. But thank you very much. Again, a great talk. Now, for the audience at home, if you like this session, feel free to like and subscribe and be kept in the loop for all our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters: Google, Intopia, Barrier Break, Tetralogical, Intuit, Infoaxia, the Law Office of Lainey Feingold, and Inclusive Design 24 will be right back in 5 minutes with our next session. So see you all there. Thank you very much, everybody.